This is a Stories to be Told podcast. Is it just me? I have often wondered how America became the nation that it is today. It is impressive that back in 1776, these 13 colonies managed to gain victory and independence over what was then arguably the most powerful nation on earth. How did these 13 colonies evolve into the 50 states that have become the largest economy and has a presidential electoral process that, once every 4 years, selects the most powerful human being and so-called leader of the free world? America is often referred to as land of the free and home of the brave, and has always had a reputation for being a country of endless opportunities for those brave enough and free enough who dare to step out of their comfort zone and dream. This aspirational quest for success and achievement is often called the American dream. But where does the American dream originate from? Moreover, whose dream is it anyway? The origins of modern American ideology are steeped within the lucrative trades of cash crops, which defined an infrastructure developed from the system of plantations and enslavement. As an ordinary person, I think I can identify with other ordinary people outside of America who have probably overlooked this part of history in the same way that I have. We focus a lot on slavery across America, but it is almost as if we have taken for granted how America got here. So how did America get here? In this podcast, I focus on an event that cannot be overlooked: the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. This was the most significant and cheapest purchase of land in America's history. It was originally intended to be the sale of what we know today as New Orleans, the land marked as the estuary of the Mississippi River that France had claimed in 1682. However, the land west of the Mississippi Basin had also been under French occupation since 1699, and this land was ceded to the Spanish in 1762, only to be reclaimed back into French hands through Napoleon in 1800. All this land, together with the estuary, was sold to a newly formed America. With independence achieved in 1776, the written Constitution of 1787 replacing the Articles of Confederacy and the inauguration of their third president, Thomas Jefferson, in 1801, this major purchase of land enabled the 13 colonies to expand their borders as far west as the Rocky Mountains, established by the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819, and as far north as Canada, adjusted by the Anglo-American Convention or Treaty of 1818. It was a massive expanse of land, some 2 million square kilometres, and costing the colonies around $15 million in those days. This purchase gave free access to trade along the Mississippi River and through its ports into the lucrative markets of the Caribbean, and this substantial purchase undoubtedly strengthened the existing colony's position both materially and strategically, as well as swelling the French coffers. What is the significance of the Louisiana Purchase to Britain's colonial past? Well, England originally created the plantation settlements that became the 13 colonies along the east coast, and even after 1776, the legacy of indenture servitude and enslavement had both become an endemic part of the social, moral, and political structure in the newly formed America. Even though England went on to abolish slavery in 1807 and throughout its empire by 1833, the blueprint for colonising and slavery practices were firmly ingrained within the settlers, who were mainly of English origin. The Louisiana Purchase added another 13 states to the existing colonies, and this created disputes between the northern and southern colonies on whether slavery should be extended into these new territories. Both the northern colonies, who opposed slavery, and the southern colonies, who upheld slavery practices, feared that each of the newly formed states would cede to its opponent. The first 2 decades after the Purchase saw the newly formed states gradually administered into the Missouri Compromise in 1820, a system that institutionalized slavery in Missouri while eliminating it in the state of Maine, which was located right next to it. This was to ensure and agree that the northern states would never be able to legislate against slavery in the remaining land from the Louisiana Purchase. This was poor compensation rather than a compromise, and thus sowed the seeds for the American Civil War and the ideologies that are characteristic of American society and politics that we see today. And was this Napoleon's land to sell? This fire sale approach is a key characteristic of colonialism, similar to the Pink Map project later on in 1885, in which Portugal assumed claim to the corridor of land in southern Africa between what it had already established as territory in the form of Angola and Mozambique. This became a dispute with Britain, who also associated discovery with ownership, and both European nations refused to acknowledge who was currently occupying that land. The fire sale approach only views the physical land as a commodity and the indigenous people as a labour source that will aid its quest for wealth and power, and fails to recognise the true value, that of the culture, values, knowledge, customs, lineage and generational legacy between the land and its people. And to whom did this land actually belong? This land was occupied by white French settlers commonly known as Acadians, who had settled from Canada during the 1700s, enslaved as well as freed Africans, and a sizable population of indigenous Indians, with whom the English and other European settlers spent much of the 1800s in constant conflict and dispute, as they attempted and succeeded in displacing the majority of these Indians from their own lands which they had inhabited for thousands of years. This conflict between the European settlers and the indigenous Indians is a narrative perpetuated through the Hollywood Western, a film genre that was quite popular from the early part of the 20th century to the 1960s. I have memories of my grandparents, who were avid watchers of these films, watching them on a Sunday afternoon. As a child, I had never enjoyed watching these films, and I still do not watch them today. I had always found something distasteful about them, and the narrative culturally biased, representing a romanticised depiction of the removal of territorial rights and displacement of America's indigenous population. A common theme for these types of films were often the cavalry, a type of military on horseback fighting the indigenous Indian. The cowboy was always portrayed as the hero who conquers all, fighting against the indigenous Indian, who is perpetually portrayed as the intruder, whose occupation of their own land and their place in the world can only be validated through playing the packman or loyal servant. This dynamic creates a perceived inequality within a broken concept of brotherhood. Although slavery of the indigenous population ended in 1836, their collective removal and forced displacement by the US government was a gradual process that began from the early 1830s to the 1850s. This process affected some 60,000 Indians across 5 different tribes who lived and thrived as autonomous nations in the area now known today as the Deep South. The Indian Removal Act in 1830 removed all rights that the Indians had to their ancestral lands, forcing them to move west of the Mississippi River. A journey which took the form of many routes which are collectively called the Trail of Tears, or in the language of the Cherokee Indian, Nuna Dal Ultsionyi, or the place where they cried. From my perspective, I can only interpret this saying as an expression of the suffering, death and loss that these Indians endured, only to be told that they were on a walk to freedom. By 1838, around 100,000 acres of this land in the Deep South was made available to European settlers. The indigenous population was in no way passive recipients, and some resisted and managed to evade relocation, remaining on their ancestral land to this very day, some of which are the Creeks in Alabama and Florida and the Cherokee in North Carolina. However, it wasn't just the Indians that were affected, as many Africans also became subject to relocation, as some had intermarried with the Indians and others were kept as slaves and therefore had no choice but to travel with them. Now, this is a learning journey which I'm certainly going to find out more about, and I encourage you to do the same. Although the cowboy does have factual merit, it has become part of the established narrative of European dominance and supremacy, expanding across this vast territory. Is this the mythological portrayal of the European male, establishing the idea of what it means to be an American, and at the heart of the ideology behind the American dream? How did the Louisiana Purchase have a wider impact on the rest of the Caribbean and in Europe? And what of the land that was sold by Napoleon? What modern-day American states did these become? And how have the indigenous Indians preserved their culture, and what reparations have they received? If you liked this podcast, then stay on this platform or my website and check out my other podcasts related to this episode: The Pink Map Project, The Ultimate Paradox, and The Book of Negroes, How Africa Came to Nova Scotia. Remember to visit storiestobetold.com. We've recently released some new content on our platform and we'll be adding more very soon. You'll also find what I call the heart and soul of the Stories to be Told movement, my current stories or poetic narratives: Caribbean Wind, Caribbean Rush, Nights at the Round Table, the Berlin Conference 1884, and Gone with the Wind, Macmillan's Speech for Change, available in ebook, Kindle and paperback versions. You'll also be able to sign up on the website, where you'll receive free samples of all 4 of our current titles. Feel free to like, follow, share and subscribe to us on our social media platforms, and as always, it's a pleasure and a privilege to share my learning journey with you in this podcast, and I encourage you to either begin or continue your own. History is a matter of fact or perspective. Thanks so much for listening again, and I'll see you on the next page.